Hello, today I'm going to read part of The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. I'll read the blurb on the back first. Nobody Owens, known to his friends as Bod, is a normal boy. He would be completely normal if he didn't live in a graveyard being raised and educated by ghosts. There are dangers and adventures for Bod in the graveyard, but it is in the land of the living that the real danger lurks, for it is there that the man Jack lives. He has already killed Bod's family. This is Chapter 1. How Nobody Came to the Graveyard. The fog was thinner as you approached the top of the hill. The half-moon shone, not as bright as day, not by any means, but enough to see the graveyard, enough for that. Look. You could see the abandoned funeral chapel, iron doors padlocked, ivy on the sides of the spire, a small tree growing out of the guttering at roof level. You could see stones and tombs and vaults and memorial plaques. You could see the occasional dash or scuttle of a rabbit or a vole or a weasel as it slipped out of the undergrowth and across the path. You would have seen these things in the moonlight if you had been there at night. You might not have seen a pale, plump woman who walked the path near the front gates, and if you had seen her, with a second, more careful glance, you would have realised she was only moonlight, mist and shadow. The plump, pale woman was there, though. She walked the path that led through the clutch of half-fallen tombstones towards the front gates. The gates were locked. They were always locked at 4 in the afternoon in winter, at 8 at night in the summer. A spike-topped iron railing ran around the part of the cemetery, a high brick wall around the rest of it. The bars of the gates were closely spaced. They would have stopped a grown man from getting through, even stopped a 10-year-old child. "Owens!" called the pale woman, in a voice that might have been the rustle of the wind through the wrong glass. "Owens, come and look at this." She crouched down and peered at something on the ground, as a patch of shadow moved into the moonlight, revealing itself to be a grizzled man in his mid-40s. He looked down at his wife, and then looked at what she was looking at, and he scratched his head. "Mistress Owens," he said, for he came from a more formal age than our own. "Is that what you think it is?" And at the sight of the thing that he was inspecting, seemed to catch sight of Mrs. Owens, for it opened its mouth, letting the dummy that it was sucking fall to the ground, and reached out a small chubby fist, as if it were trying for all the world to hold on to Mrs. Owens' pale finger. "Strike me silly," said Mr. Owens, "if that isn't a baby." "Of course it's a baby," said his wife. "The question is, what's to be done with it?" "We dare say that is a question, Mrs. Owens," said her husband, "and yet it is not our question. For this here baby is unquestionably alive, and as is such nothing to do with us, and is no part of our world." "Oh, but look at him smile," said Mrs. Owens. "He has the sweetest of smiles." And with one insubstantial hand she stroked the child's sparse blonde hair. The little boy giggled with delight. A chilly breeze blew across the graveyard, scattering the fog in the lower slopes of the place, for the graveyard covered the whole of the top of the hill, and its paths wound up the hill and down and back upon themselves. A rattling. Someone at the main gate of the graveyard was pulling and shaking it, rattling the old gates and the heavy padlock and chains that held them. "There now," said Owens. "It's the babe's family, come to bring him back to their loving bosom. Leave the little man be," he added, because Mrs. Owens was putting her insubstantial arms around the toddler, smoothing and stroking him. Mrs. Owens said, "He don't look like nobody's family, that one." The man in the dark coat had given up on rattling the main gates and was now examining the smaller side gate. It too was well locked. There had been some vandalism in the graveyard the previous year, and the council had taken steps. "Come on, Mistress Owens, leave it be, there's a dear," said Mr. Owens when he saw the ghost, and his mouth dropped open, and he found himself unable to think of anything to say. You might think, and if you did you would be right, that Mr. Owens should not have been taken aback at seeing a ghost, given that Mr. and Mrs. Owens were themselves dead and had been for a few hundred years now, and given that the entirety of their social life, or very nearly, was spent with those who were also dead. There was a difference between the folk of the graveyard and this. A raw, flickering, startling shape, the grey colour of television static, all panic and naked emotion, which flooded the Owenses as if it were their own. 3 figures, 2 large, 1 smaller, but only one of them was in focus. It was more than an outline or a shimmer. The figure said, "My baby. He is trying to harm my baby." A clattering. The man outside was hauling a heavy metal rubbish bin across the alley to the high brick wall that ran around that part of the graveyard. "Protect my son," said the ghost, and Mrs. Owens thought it was a woman. Of course, the babe's mother. "What did he do to you?" asked Mrs. Owens. She was not certain that the ghost could hear her. Recently dead, poor love, she thought. It's always easier to die gently, to wake in due time in the place you were buried, to come to terms with your death and get acquainted with the other inhabitants. This creature was nothing but alarm and fear for her child, and her panic, which felt to the Owenses like a low-pitched screaming, was now attracting the attention, for other pale figures were coming towards them from all over the graveyard. "Who are you, Caius Pompeius?" asked the figure. His headstone was now only a weathered lump of rock, but 2,000 years earlier he had been asked to be laid to rest on the mound beside the marble shrine, rather than have his body sent back to Rome, and he was one of the most senior citizens of the graveyard. He took his responsibilities extremely seriously. "Are you buried here?" "Of course she's not. Freshly dead by the look of her." Mrs. Owens put an arm around the woman's shape and spoke to it privately, in a low voice, calm and sensible. There was a thump and a crash from the high wall beside the alley. A rubbish bin had fallen. A man clambered up onto the top of the wall, a dark outline against the mist-smudged streetlights. He paused for a moment, then climbed down the other side, holding on to the top of the wall, legs dangling, and let himself fall in the last few feet down into the graveyard. "But my dear," Mrs. Owens said to the shape, now all that was left of the 3 shapes that had appeared in the graveyard, "he's living. We're not. Can you imagine?" The child was looking up at them, puzzled. It reached for one of them, then the other, finding nothing but air. The woman's shape was fading fast. "Yes," said Mrs. Owens, in response to something that no one else had heard. "If we can, then we will." Then she turned to the man beside her. "And you, Owens, will you be a father to this little lad?" "Will I what?" said Owens, his brow crinkling. "We never had a child," said his wife, "and his mother wants us to protect him. Will you say yes?" The man in the black coat had tripped in the tangle of ivy and half-broken headstones. Now he got to his feet and walked forward more carefully, startling an owl, which rose on silent wings. He could see the baby, and there was triumph in his eyes. Owens knew what his wife was thinking when she used that tone of voice. They had not, in life and death, been married for over 250 years for nothing. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Are you sure?" "Sure as I have ever been of anything," said Mrs. Owens. "Then yes, if you'll be its mother, I'll be its father." "Did you hear that?" Mrs. Owens asked the flickering shape in the graveyard, now little more than an outline, like distant summer lightning in the shape of a woman. It said something to her that no one else could hear, and then it was gone. "She'll not come here again," said Mr. Owens. "Next time she wakes it'll be in her own graveyard, or wherever it is that she's going." Mrs. Owens bent down to the baby and extended her arms. Come now, she said warmly. Come to Mamma. To the man Jack, walking through the graveyard towards them on a path, his knife already in his hand, it seemed as if a swirl of mist had curled around the child in the moonlight, and that the boy was no longer there, just damp mist and moonlight and swaying grass. He blinked and sniffed the air. Something had happened, but he had no idea what it was. He growled in the back of his throat, like a beast of prey, angry and frustrated. "Hello!" called the man Jack, wondering if perhaps the child had stepped behind something. His voice was dark and rough, and there was an odd edge to it, as if of surprise or puzzlement at hearing himself speak. The graveyard kept its secrets. "Hello!" he called again. He hoped to hear a baby cry or utter a half word, or to hear it move. He did not expect what he actually heard. A voice, silky smooth, saying, "Can I help you?" The man Jack was tall. This man was taller. The man Jack wore dark clothes. This man's clothes were darker. People who noticed the man Jack when he went about his business, and he did not like to be noticed, were troubled or made uncomfortable or found themselves unaccountably scared. The man Jack looked up at the stranger, and it was the man Jack who was troubled. "I was looking for someone," said the man Jack, slipping his right hand back into his coat pocket so the knife was hidden, but there if he needed it. "In a locked graveyard at night," said the stranger dryly. "It was just a baby," said the man Jack. "I was just passing when I heard a baby cry. I thought I looked through the gates and I saw him. Well, what would anyone do?" "I applaud your public spiritedness," said the stranger. "Yet, if you manage to find this child, how are you planning on getting out of here with it? You can't climb back over a wall holding a baby." "Well, I would have called until someone let me out," said the man Jack. A heavy jingling of keys. "Well, that would have been me then," said the stranger. "I would have had to let you out." He selected one large key from the key ring and said, "Follow me." The man Jack walked behind the stranger. He took his knife from his pocket. "Are you the caretaker, then?" "Am I?" "Certainly, in a manner of speaking," said the stranger. They were walking towards the gates, and the man Jack was certain away from the baby. But the caretaker had the keys. A knife in the dark. That's all it would take. Then he could search for the child all through the night if he needed to. He raised the knife. "If there was a baby," said the stranger without looking back, "it wouldn't have been here in the graveyard. Perhaps you're mistaken. It's unlikely that a child would come in here after all. Much more likely that you heard the night bird, saw a cat, perhaps a fox. They declared this place an official nature reserve, 30 years ago, round the time of the last funeral. Now think carefully, and tell me you are certain that it was a child that you saw." The man Jack thought. The stranger unlocked the side gate. "A fox," he said. "They make the most uncommon noises, not unlike a person crying. No, your visit to this graveyard was a mistake, sir. Somewhere the child you seek awaits you, but it's not here." And he let the thought sit there in the man Jack's head for a moment before he opened the gate with a flourish. "Delighted to have made your acquaintance," he said, "and I trust that you will find everything you need out there." The man Jack stood outside the gates to the graveyard. The stranger stood inside the gate, and he locked it again and put away the key. "Where are you going?" asked the man Jack. "There are other gates than this," said the stranger. My car is on the other side of the hill. Don't mind me. You don't even have to remember this conversation." "No," said the man Jack agreeably. "I don't." He remembered wandering up the hill, that what he thought to be a child had turned out to be a fox, that a helpful caretaker had escorted him back out to the street. He snipped his knife back into the sheath. "Well," he said, "good night." "A good night to you," said the stranger, whom Jack had taken for a caretaker. The man Jack sat off down the hill in pursuit of the infant. From the shadows, the stranger watched Jack until he was out of sight. Then he moved through the night, up and up to the flat place below the brow of the hill, a place dominated by an obelisk, and a flat stone set into the ground, dedicated to the memory of Josiah Worthington, local brewer, politician, and later baronet, who had, almost 300 years before, bought the old cemetery and the land around it, and given it to the city in perpetuity. He had reserved himself the best location on the hill, a natural amphitheatre, with a view of the whole city and beyond, and had ensured that the graveyard endured as a graveyard, for which the inhabitants of the graveyard were grateful, although they never quite as grateful as Josiah Worthington, but felt they should have been. They were, all told, some 10,000 souls in a graveyard, but most of them slept deep or took no interest in the night-to-night affairs of this place, and there were less than 300 of them up here in the amphitheatre in the moonlight. The stranger reached them as silently as the fog itself, and he watched the proceedings unfold from the shadows, and he said nothing. Josiah Worthington was speaking. He said, "My dear madam, your obduracy well, can't you see how ridiculous this is?" "No," said Mrs. Owens, "I can't." She was sitting cross-legged on the ground, and the living child was sleeping in her lap. She cradled its head with her pale hands. "What Mistress Owens is trying to say, sir, begging your honour's pardon," said Mr. Owens, standing beside her, "is that she doesn't see it that way. She sees it as doing her duty." Mr. Owens had seen Josiah Worthington in the flesh back when they were both alive, had in fact made several pieces of fine furniture for the Worthingtons' manor house out near Inglesham, and was still in awe of him. "Her duty," Josiah Worthington said, as if to dislodge a strand of cobweb. "Your duty, madam, is to the graveyard, and to the commonalty of those who form the population of discarnate spirits, revenants, and such like wights. And your duty, thus, is to return the creature as soon as possible to its natural home, which is not here." "His mamma gave the boy to me," said Mrs. Owens, as if that was all that was needed to be said. "My dear woman—" "I am not your dear woman," said Mrs. Owens, getting to her feet. "Truth to tell, I don't see why I'm even here, talking to you fiddle-pated old dunderheads, when this lad here is going to wake up hungry soon enough. And where am I going to find food for him in this graveyard, I should like to know?" "Which," said Caius Pompeius stiffly, "is precisely the point. What will you feed him, woman? How can you care for him?" Mrs. Owens' eyes burned. "I can already look after him," she said, "as well as his own mamma. She already gave him to me. Look, I'm holding him, aren't I? I'm touching him." "Now see reason, Betsy," said Mother Slaughter, a tiny old thing, in a huge bonnet and cape that she had worn in life and been buried wearing. "Where would he live?" "Here," said Mrs. Owens. "We could give him the freedom of the graveyard." Mother Slaughter's mouth became a tiny O. "But," she said, But I never." "Well, why not? It ain't the first time we've given the freedom of the graveyard to an outsider." "That is true," said Caius Pompeius, "but he wasn't alive." And with that, the stranger realized that he was being drawn, like it or not, into the conversation, and reluctantly he stepped out of the shadows, detaching from them like a patch of darkness. "No," he agreed, "I am not. But I take Mrs. Owens' point. Josiah Worthington said, "You do, Silas?" "I do. For good or for evil, and I firmly believe that it is for good, Mrs. Owens and her husband have taken this child under their protection. It is going to take more than just a couple of good-hearted souls to raise this child. It will," said Silas, "take a graveyard." An interesting beginning. What a way to be raised. Hope you enjoyed that. We'll have another story for you soon. Take care now. Bye-bye.